Please be advised, this episode does have content that some may find distressing. As always, listener discretion is advised and it is not suitable for anyone under the age of 13.
Hello and welcome to It's Murder Up North. In this, the final episode in the Unintentional mini-series within the Albert Pierrepoint series, join me as I delve into what led to John Christie being brought to justice and the aftermath. I was going to fix some shelves in the kitchen, and knocked the wall, first above what appeared to be a door, and then just at the top of it. It appeared to be hollow. I then took a torch and tore the top corner of the paper away. I shone my torch through the hole I made and saw the back of somebody's body. I called another tenant and we fetched the police. These are the words of Beresford Brown, the man who uncovered the horrific secrets John Christie had concealed within his flat at 10 Rillington Place. Secrets that could have remained hidden for years, had it not been for Beresford's decision to put some shelves up in the kitchen once occupied by Ethel and John Christie. It was this simple act of DIY that led to the victims' bodies being discovered just days after Christie had vacated the premises, but as the police arrived, his whereabouts were unknown. Following the death of Hectorina McLennan, who would be his final victim, John Christie, having sold his possessions, arranged for his beloved Irish Terrier to be put to sleep, and being unable to make his next rental payment, made what he would later call a stupid decision. He moved out of 10 Rillington Place on the 20th of March 1953, which in turn allowed for the possibility that the bodies would be found. Although he had ensured the alcove had been covered, and he had wallpapered over it, so as far as he was concerned, they may have lain there undiscovered for months, if not years. He opted to sublet his rooms to Mr. and Mrs. Riley, from whom he received £7.13 as a deposit, and they agreed they would pay him a weekly rent of 12 shillings 8 dimes. The unsuspecting Rileys were informed by Christie that he would be relocating to Birmingham, where his wife had been residing for the last 3 months. Hence why he was renting out the rooms. But as with many tales told by the 54-year-old, it was all lies. His wife lay deceased beneath the living room floor, and he had no right to be renting out the property, which the Rileys would learn when the rightful landlord discovered they were living in the flat, and just 24 hours after they moved in, the pair were evicted with the assistance of the police. On the 24th of March 1953, just 4 days after Christie had vacated the flat, Beresford Brown made the discovery that would render 10 Rillington Place as an infamous house of horrors. As the hunt began for the flat's previous tenant, the unenviable task of searching the home commenced. Amongst the first officers to arrive at the scene was P.C. Leslie Seisman, who recalled the sight that lay in the void, stating, quote, "I could see the body of a woman in a sitting position back to the opening, with her head and shoulders hunched." Another officer who stared into the void that night claimed, "Over the years I have seen some shocking sights, but never one so unnerving as that which greeted ourselves." Entering the kitchen of the ground floor flat, the gas stove and range lay along the wall facing the door, while on the opposite side was located a small table and sink. Passing between the range and the table, a cupboard had once stood, which had concealed the void, and although the cupboard had been removed prior to moving, Christie had wallpapered over the doorway. With the hidden chamber revealed, it was clear that despite the cramped nature of the space, being only 4 foot high and 5.5 feet deep, there was more than one body inside. It transpired there were 3, all of which had been kept preserved by the cool temperature within the alcove. The first body belonged to Hectorina McLennan, who, accompanied by her boyfriend, had stayed with Christie for a couple of days when the pair were in desperate need of a place to stay. When Hectorina went missing, her partner Alexander had visited the flat, only to be told that she had not been back there since the couple had left. And to further demonstrate what a cold and callous individual Christie was, he allowed Alexander to search each room, before he made the concerned boyfriend a pot of tea, which the pair sat drinking, while Hectorina's remains lay just feet away. Unfortunately, due to Hectorina's tendencies to be absent for days at a time, no missing person report was made to the police. It was Hectorina's body that Beresford Brown had glimpsed through the hole in the wall. Her back to the opening, she was held in a seated position by the structure of her brassiere, to which had been tied the end of a blanket, which led to the feet of the body in the middle. Hectorina's body was removed and photographed, allowing the forensics team to access the second set of remains, identified later as Kathleen Maloney, who was last seen in January 1953. But having been estranged from her family, lacking any close friends, and not having a permanent abode, she had not been reported missing. The blanket that had been tied to Hectorina's brassiere was wrapped about Kathleen's body, with the fabric being secured about her ankles with a sock. She was lying forward, resting on top of the third body, and her skin, clothing and wrappings were coated in dust and ash, perhaps remnants from when the alcove had been used as coal storage. The final body recovered from the alcove belonged to Rita Nelson, who had been 24 weeks pregnant when she was last seen on the 14th of January 1953. She had been reported missing by her landlady when the usually reliable Rita failed to make her rental payment. Yet a letter amongst her belongings regarding her pregnancy led to the conclusion that Rita had chosen to disappear of her own accord, with her sister believing that her sibling had died on a ship that had sunk en route to Ireland where their family lived. Rita's remains rested in a bizarre pose. She had been positioned on her back, with her legs placed vertically against the wall, leading to suggestions that she had been moved like this in order for Christie to accommodate the other remains. As with Kathleen, Rita was also wrapped in a blanket, which had been secured at the ankles with a piece of wire, and her body was coated with dirt. The discovery prompted a thorough search of the property, and later that evening the investigation moved into the front room, with its bay window facing out onto the street. It had once been used as Ethel and John Christie's living room, where the latter would sit reading the paper or listening to the wireless, while his cat and dog curled up at his feet. As investigators moved about the room, one officer noted that a number of the floorboards were loose, and the decision was made to pull them up. The void beneath had been filled with rubble, and as this was removed, a form wrapped in a blanket was discovered. These were the remains of John's wife Ethel, who had last been seen alive in December 1952. Yet Christie had managed to allay any suspicions by telling neighbours that his wife had gone to stay with family, while in turn writing to her loved ones with excuses as to why she couldn't write herself, for instance claiming that the arthritis in her hand was preventing her from doing so. His calm and convincing manner ensuring that no concerns were raised with the police regarding Ethel's absence. The bodies were taken to Kensington Mortuary for further investigation, with the coroner reporting that victim 1, later identified as Hectorina, who he estimated was roughly 20 years old, she was actually 26, and had been deceased for roughly 4 weeks, with her cause of death being noted as carbon monoxide poisoning, and that a rope or cord had been used to strangle her. During the physical examination, it was concluded that a sexual assault had occurred close to the time of death, and that scratches on her back had likely been caused after death, probably when the perpetrator dragged the body to where it was concealed. Unlike the first victim, the second was still clothed, although the garments were in a state of disarray. The items were listed as being a cardigan and vest, while between her legs had been placed a t-shirt which appeared to have been used to form a makeshift nappy. The coroner noted that the woman's skin had a pink tinge to it, suggestive of gas poisoning, and that like the first body, she too had been strangled and sexually assaulted around the time of her death, which had occurred between 8 and 12 weeks prior. With the second victim, it was also stated that she had a high level of alcohol in her system, suggesting she had been heavily under the influence on the day she died. She would be identified as Kathleen Maloney. The third individual was also clothed, wearing a dress, petticoat, bra, cardigan, and 2 vests. She too had a pink tone to her skin and showed signs of strangulation. Unlike the second body, a piece of fabric had been placed between the woman's legs. It was also stated that the individual had consumed alcohol prior to her death, which was believed to have happened between 8 to 12 weeks earlier. During the autopsy, it was also confirmed that the woman, who was approximately 25 years old, was 6 months pregnant and would soon be named as Rita Nelson. The fourth body, which had been found under the floorboards, had been wrapped in a blanket, with a pillowcase covering the head. When this layer was removed, it revealed the figure had also been encased in a floral dress and silk nightgown, yet her stockings appeared to be undisturbed. Physically, she appeared older than the other women, with the coroner placing her as being around 50 years old, going on to describe her as being plump and having a number of missing teeth. Aside from the difference in age, it was also noted that this victim had not been sexually assaulted or exposed to poisonous gas, with her cause of death being determined as asphyxiation, most likely with some sort of fabric or rope. This body was deemed to be that of Ethel Christie, and her time of death, which was placed between 12 to 15 weeks earlier, was consistent with her last being seen in December 1952. By the 25th of March 1953, the newspapers had been made aware of the findings at the property the previous day, and amidst the reports were issued descriptions of John Christie, with the Times reporting that he was 5'9", slim build, dark hair, thin on top, clean shaven, sallow complexion, long nose, wearing horn-rimmed spectacles, dentures top and bottom, walks with a military bearing, wearing a dark blue herringbone suit, brown leather shoes, fawn-belted raincoat, and a brown trilby hat. Having left 10 Rillington Place on the 20th of March, Christie had checked into Rawton House at King's Cross, an establishment which had been founded to provide cheap lodgings for the working man, and it was an imposing structure that dominated the corner of King's Cross Road and Calthorpe Street until its demolition in 2007. Seems that when Christie arrived there, he was not concerned about going under the radar, which was evident by the fact it was only 5 miles from Rillington Place, and he had checked in using his real name and booked a room for a week. This suggests he had likely gone there to take advantage of the cheap rooms, and fully intended to stay close to his former home. However, 5 days after checking in, the news of the bodies being found in his flat would send him into a panic. He left his lodgings at Rawton House, despite having already paid for an additional 3 days. Having seen the reports with his description that included that he was wearing his fawn-belted raincoat and brown trilby hat, Christie sold both items to another man and purchased some new clothes. Knowing he could not return to Rawton House or take up lodgings in any other establishment, he opted to sleep in darkened movie theatres or on park benches, while during the day he would sit quietly in the corner of busy cafes, hoping not to be recognised. Oddly enough, he seemed to make no attempt to leave the capital. On the morning of March 31st, 1953, Christie was walking along the embankment of the Thames, close to Putney Bridge, when he was witnessed by 2 dock workers, who remarked on the man's resemblance to the individual who was being sought by police regarding the bodies at Rillington Place. Shortly after this, a police officer crossing Putney Bridge spotted a rather dishevelled-looking man standing on the bridge. The officer approached the man, whose face was partially concealed by the brim of his hat. When asked to provide his name and address, the man replied, quote, "John Waddington, 35 Westbourne Grove," but he went on to claim that he did not have any way to prove his identity. Wishing to have a better look at the man, the officer requested he removed his hat, and it was at that point he noticed the high forehead and receding hairline of the man the police had been hunting for. "You are Christie, aren't you?" the officer asked, to which the man admitted that he was. Without any fuss, Christie allowed the officer to arrest him. While being driven in the police van, he presented his wallet, which contained an identity card, ration book, union card, and an ambulance card, all confirming he was John Christie. Also wedged in his wallet was a folded newspaper clipping related to the Timothy Evans case. After being booked into the cells at Putney Police Station, Christie was questioned, and on the 1st of April 1953 he was charged with the murder of his wife Ethel. Prior to him being confronted with the evidence, Christie offered up his first version of what had happened to each of the 4 women that had been recovered from his home. With regards to Ethel, he alleged that he had been woken by her convulsing in the bed. Her skin had turned blue and she became unresponsive. He claimed that despite attempts to help her, he could not save her life, and hating to see his wife suffering, He said he placed a pair of stockings about her neck until she was dead. Christie stated that he then saw an almost empty bottle of sleeping pills and believed his wife had taken them to end her life, backing up this conclusion by stating she had been suffering from depression and anxiety due to the distress caused by other residents in the house. It was confirmed by her doctor that Ethel had been suffering from anxiety and depression, and he had prescribed her with some medication to help her sleep. However, post-mortem found that there was no evidence that Ethel had overdosed, and the conclusion of the examination only corroborated that she had been strangled. In his confession, Christie had presented Ethel's death as a mercy killing, with him claiming he could not stand to see her suffering. Was there more to the story? Had Ethel wanted to leave Rillington Place, and perhaps move back to Sheffield due to what Christie had claimed were unbearable living conditions? After all, he did tell neighbours that she had left to go to live elsewhere, and he had planned to follow her. Or perhaps Ethel had confronted Christie, having learned that he was using sex workers. Or maybe she had a gnawing suspicion regarding what happened to Beryl and Geraldine Evans, and she chose to speak up. Or had she become angry that he had resigned from his job, placing the financial burdens on her shoulders? For a man who desired control, being confronted by his wife, and potentially being given an ultimatum by her, may have prompted him to seize back control and end her life. Of course, this is all speculation, with the only certainty being that Christie strangled his wife and concealed her body beneath the floorboards of their living room. Having admitted to killing Ethel, he then proceeded to inform officers about the women in the alcove, all of whom he claimed died because of their own actions. They had become aggressive, tried to force themselves upon him, causing Christie to defend himself. These initial confessions were made prior to him being confronted with the evidence, which would force him to change his story. His confessions, however, seemed to be muddled, with him claiming that his first victim was Kathleen Maloney, although her position in the alcove suggests otherwise, with Rita Nelson appearing to have been the first to be placed there, and the post-mortem led towards the conclusion that Rita had died before the other two women. So the account of the first killing probably relates to Rita rather than Kathleen. Christie would claim in his initial statement regarding Rita's death that, quote, "One evening I went up to Ladbroke Grove to get some fish and chips for the animals. On the way back to Ladbroke Grove, a drunken woman stood in front of me and demanded £1 for me to take her around the corner. I said, I'm not interested, and I haven't got money to throw away. I'm not like that. I haven't had intercourse with any woman for over 2 years. My doctor will tell you that. She then demanded 30 shillings and said she would scream and say that I had interfered with her if I didn't give it to her. I walked away, as I am so well known around there, and she obviously would have created a scene. She came along. She wouldn't go. She came right to the door, still demanding 30 shillings. When I opened the door, she forced her way in. I went to the kitchen, and she was still on about this 30 shillings. I tried to get her out, and she picked up a frying pan to hit me. I closed with her, and there was a struggle, and she fell back on a chair. It was a deck chair. There was a piece of rope hanging from the chair. I don't remember what happened, but I must have gone haywire. Next thing I remember, she was lying still in the chair with the rope round her neck. I don't remember taking it off. It couldn't have been tied. I left her there and went into the front room. After that, I believe I had a cup of tea and went to bed. I got up in the morning and went to the kitchen and washed and shaved. She was still in the chair. I believed I made some tea, and I pulled away a small cupboard in the corner and gained access to a small alcove. I knew it was there because a pipe burst during the frosty weather, and a plumber opened it up to mend the pipe. I must have put her in there. I don't remember doing it, but I remember pulling away the cupboard because it came away in 2 pieces. I slung her clothes in the bedroom. She started to undress before she picked up the frying pan. I put the small cupboard back. It wasn't a fixture." End quote. He proceeded to recall how he met Kathleen Maloney, recalling, quote, "Some time after this, I suppose it was February, I went into a cafe at Notting Hill Gate for a cup of tea and a sandwich. The cafe was pretty full. There wasn't much space. 2 girls sat at a table and I sat opposite at the same table. They were talking about rooms, where they had been looking to get accommodation. Then one of them spoke to me. She asked me for a cigarette, and then started conversation. During the conversation I mentioned about leaving my flat and that it would be vacant very soon, and they suggested coming down to see it together in the evening. It will later be stated that he had known Kathleen for a number of months, and that on one occasion she and her friend Maureen had attended a photo shoot, during which Christie had asked Maureen to undress, before he too undressed and asked Kathleen to photograph himself with her friend. Maureen would later state that on a number of occasions Christie had drunk with them in the local pubs and given them money. She would also recount the last time she saw Kathleen, with whom she had been drinking when Christie approached them. She recalled he, quote, bought us each 2 drinks, and as he was leaving she asked him to give the price of another drink, and he gave her 2 shillings. He and Maloney left together between 9 till 10 p.m. Kathleen had stated to another patron at the pub that she was meeting a man that night who could help her find a place to stay, and although she did not name him, it was likely she was talking about Christie. And so, in a drunken state and in desperate need of a bed for the night, Kathleen ended up at 10 Rillington Place. Despite having been witnessed leaving the pub with Kathleen, Christie would claim in his statement that he had arranged for her to come and view the flat with her friend, and that he would meet them at the property, but only Kathleen showed up. Either way, he had managed to ensnare another vulnerable woman. He would state that after viewing the property, Kathleen, quote, said it would be suitable, subject to the landlord's permission. It was then that she made suggestions that she would visit me for a few days. She said this so that I would use my influence with the landlord as a sort of payment in kind. I was rather annoyed and told her that it didn't interest me. I think she started saying I was making accusations against her when she saw there was nothing doing. She said she would bring somebody down to me. I thought she meant she was going to bring some of the boys down to me. I believe it was then that she mentioned something about Irish blood. Portraying Kathleen as the aggressor, he continued, quote, she was in a violent temper. I remember she started fighting. I am very quiet. I avoid fighting. As with Rita Nelson, Christie would go on to allude to a gap in his memory that prevented him from recalling how Kathleen had died, with him simply stating, quote, I know there was something. It's in the back of my mind. She was on the floor. I must have put her in the alcove straight away. He then concluded with his account of what had happened to Hectorina McLennan, whom he had met at the beginning of March 1953, with him claiming that he, quote, met a man and a woman coming out of a cafe at Hammersmith. If I remember rightly, I'd been to sign on that day. It was in the morning. The man went across the road to talk to a friend, and while he was away, she said that they had to give up their diggings at the weekend. He was out of work. Then I told her that if they hadn't found anywhere, I could put them up for a few days. The couple, Hectorina and her boyfriend Alexander, took Christie up on his kind offer, and would reside with him from the 3rd until the 7th of March, at which point Christie claimed, quote, I told them they would have to go, as he was being very unpleasant. He told me that the police were looking for her for some offence. When they left, the man said that if they couldn't find anywhere, could they come back for that night. Christie alleged that he agreed to that arrangement, but was surprised when Hectorina returned to the flat later that day, unaccompanied by Alexander. In his police statement, Christie wrote, the girl came back alone. She asked if he had called, and I said no, but I was expecting him. She said she would wait. I advised her not to. She insisted on staying in case he came. I told her she couldn't, and that he may be looking for her, and that she must go, and that she couldn't stay there alone. She was very funny about it. I got hold of her arm to try and lead her out. I pushed her out of the kitchen. She started struggling like anything, and some of her clothing got torn. She then sort of fell limp as I had hold of her. She sank to the ground, and I think some of her clothes must have got caught round her neck in the struggle. She was just out of the kitchen in the passageway. I tried to lift her, but I couldn't. I then pulled her into the kitchen onto the chair. I felt her pulse, but it wasn't beating. I pulled the cupboard away again, and I must have put her in there. 2 hours after Hectorina had failed to meet him at a cafe, as Christie expected, Alexander turned up at Rillington Place, searching for her. But the boyfriend was convinced by the middle-aged man that Hectorina would not return to the flat, and so, not suspecting anything, Alexander walked away. Throughout his statement to the police, Christie not only placed the blame on the victims and alluded to moments of amnesia, but he failed to address some of the evidence that had been uncovered during the investigation. For instance, his claim did not explain the pink tone to the victim's skin, which suggested they had been poisoned by gas. While Christie was being held for questioning regarding the deaths of the 4 women, the home at Rillington Place was being thoroughly searched, and upon examination of the rear yard, the discovery of a femur that was being used to prop up the fence prompted the excavation of the earth, beneath which was found skeletal remains. It was not certain how many individuals these belonged to, or whether they were complete, until the bones were reassembled at the mortuary. At the time, the technology wasn't available to perform a full post-mortem, and so only a basic analysis was made, with the conclusion being drawn that the skeletons belonged to 2 women, one of whom had a filling, which was most commonly found in Eastern European dentistry. This clue would help them identify the remains as being Ruth First, an Austrian woman who had come to England to escape the Nazi regime. Upon learning that the bodies had been unearthed, Christie would make a statement on the 5th of June 1953, explaining how they ended up buried in the garden of Rillington Place. Starting with the murder of Ruth, he stated, quote, "When I was in the police war reserve, I met an Austrian girl in the snack bar at the junction of Lancaster Road and Ladbroke Grove. It was in the summer of 1943. I was living in the ground floor flat at number 10 Rillington Place, and my wife was away in Sheffield." He would later allege Ruth would accompany him while he patrolled his patch as a police officer, during which time they would have engaged in conversations. In his police statement, he claimed, quote, "I got friendly with her. She went to Rillington Place with me 2 or 3 times." Despite these visits to the flat occurring while Ethel was away, Christie would later claim that the relationship was platonic. He also argued that Ruth had not been a sex worker, although whether that was to defend her reputation or his can be debated. He went on to state to the police that the relationship changed when, quote, "One day, when this Austrian girl was with me in the flat at 10 Rillington Place, she undressed and wanted me to have intercourse with her. I got a telegram while she was there saying my wife was on her way home. The girl wanted us to team up together and go right away somewhere together. I would not do that. I got onto the bed and had intercourse with her. While I was having intercourse with her, I strangled her with a piece of rope. She was completely naked. I tried to put some of her clothes back on her. She had a leopard skin coat, and I wrapped this around her. I took her from the bedroom into the front room and put her under the floorboards. I had to do that because my wife was coming back. I put the remainder of her clothes under the floorboard too. My wife came home in the evening. My brother-in-law, Mr. Waddington, came with her. Mr. Waddington went home the next day, and during the afternoon my wife went out. Later in the day I dug a hole in the garden, and in the evening, when it was dark, about 10 o'clock, I should say, I put the body down in the hole and covered it up quickly with earth. My wife never knew. I told her I was going to the lavatory. The only lavatory is in the garden. Months later I was digging in the garden, and I probably misjudged where I was, or something like that. I found the skull and put it in the dustbin and covered it up." And there Ruth's body would remain for 10 years, the first known victim of John Christie. He would then move on to address the murder of Muriel Eady, a woman who had been a co-worker at the ultra-electric factory. In his statement, he admitted, "I got friendly with a woman named Eady. She was about 30. She used to live at Putney. I took this woman and her man friend to Rillington Place and introduced them to my wife. They came several times together and had tea, and on one occasion we all went out to the pictures together. On one occasion she came alone. I believed she complained of catarrh, and I said I thought I could help her. She came by appointment when my wife was out. I believe my wife was on holiday. I think I mixed some stuff up, some inhalants. Friar's balsam was one. She was in the kitchen at the time. She was inhaling with a square scarf over her head. I remember now, it was in the bedroom. The liquid inhalant was in a square glass jar with a metal screw-top lid. I'd made 2 holes in the lid, and through one of the holes I put a rubber tube from the gas into the liquid. Through the other hole I put another rubber tube, about 2 feet long. This tube didn't touch the liquid. The idea was to stop what was coming from smelling of gas. She inhaled the stuff through the tube. I did it to make her dog pee. She became sort of unconscious, and I have a vague recollection of getting a stocking and tying it round her neck. I am not too clear about this. I've got them confused. It may have been the Austrian girl that I used the gas on. I don't think it was both. I believe I had intercourse with her at the time I strangled her. I think I put her in the wash-house, and that night I buried her in the garden on the right-hand side nearest the yard. As with his previous confessions, he relied on the idea of his poor memory to gloss over some of the more incriminating details, and some details would change in subsequent tellings of the events. Some of this could be blamed on him suffering from a form of amnesia, which his doctor would confirm, while others could simply be the amount of time that had passed since the first two murders. However, some argued that he was using these gaps in his memory to support a claim of insanity. He had blacked out, and during those moments he was not aware of his actions. This speculation was added to by what is considered to be his most controversial confession, with some believing that he had only admitted to the crime to aid his insanity plea, and it had prompted psychiatrist Dr. Hobson to ask Christie, quote, "Are you saying this on the basis of the more the madder?" Others, however, believed that the following statement is, by Christie's standards of the truth, the closest account of what truly happened to Beryl Evans, whose husband, Timothy, had been charged for her murder. Yet, in June 1953, Christie would confess to being the real killer. Christie began his statement by recalling the volatile nature of the Evanses' marriage, with him bearing witness to many arguments during the couple's stay at Rillington Place. He stated that, quote, "In August 1949 there was a terrific row upstairs, on the top floor between Mr. and Mrs. Evans, and a blonde who was living with them. That evening Evans went out with the blonde, and he was carrying a suitcase. He came back later alone." This part of his statement pertained to an incident that had occurred between the couple in August 1949, when Timothy was believed to be having a fling with a friend of Beryl's called Lucy, who had been residing with them at the time. The issue came to a head when Timothy's mother, Thomasina, came to the flat and confronted Lucy, ordering the 17-year-old to leave the home. The teenager attempted to hit Thomasina, and Beryl struck her back, but instead of Timothy coming to the defence of his wife and his mother, he sided with Lucy and left the property, and that was when Christie witnessed Evans leaving with the blonde girl. Following this incident, Christie claimed that, quote, "Mrs. Evans told my wife she was going down to the police court to get a separation from her husband. At a later period, Mrs. Evans told me that her husband was knocking her about, and that she was going to make an end of it, meaning she was going to commit suicide." Having introduced the idea that Beryl Evans was intent on ending her life, he continued by describing an attempt she made in November of 1949, with him recalling, quote, "One morning shortly after this, would have been early in November, I went upstairs and found Mrs. Evans lying on a quilt in front of the fireplace in the kitchen. She'd made an attempt to gas herself. I opened the door and window wide because there was a lot of gas in the room. There was a gas pipe on the left-hand side of the fireplace with a tap about 2 feet 6 inches from the floor at about level with the top of the kitchen fireplace. There was a piece of rubber tubing from the tap to near her head. She was lying with her head towards the window. She was fully dressed and was not covered with anything. When I opened the door and window, she started to come round. I gave her a drink of water. I do not know what she said, but a little while after she complained of a headache, and I made her a cup of tea. My wife was downstairs, but I didn't call her, or tell her. Mrs. Evans asked me not to tell anyone. Mr. Evans was out, and I don't know if there was anyone else in the house. I had a cup of tea too, because my head was thumping, because I had got the effects of it. The gas, too. After a little while I went downstairs. When I went up to Mrs. Evans at lunchtime the next day, she begged me to help her go through with it, meaning to help her commit suicide. She said she would do anything if I would help her. I think she was referring to letting me be intimate with her. She brought the quilt from the front room and put it down in front of the fireplace. She lay on the quilt. She was fully dressed. I got on my knees and found I was not physically capable of having intercourse with her, owing to the fact that I had fibrositis in my back and enteritis. We were both fully dressed. I turned the gas tap on, and as near as I can make out, I held it close to her face. When she became unconscious, I turned the tap off. I was going to try again to have intercourse with her, but it was not possible. I couldn't bend over. I think that's when I strangled her. It was with a stocking I found in the room." He then proceeded to explain what happened when Timothy Evans returned home from work, in a statement that bears similar details to those given by the condemned man 3 years earlier. Christie described, quote, "Evans came home in the evening about 6 p.m. It was dark when I heard him come in. I spoke to him in the passage and told him that his wife had committed suicide, that she had gassed herself." In Evans's statement, he claimed he had been greeted by Christie, but was informed that the procedure had not gone well, with the allegation being that Christie had offered to carry out an illegal abortion, during which Beryl had died. Christie, however, denied this claim when he was asked about it in 1949. Continuing with his police statement, Christie described what occurred after he had met Timothy in the hallway, quote, "I went upstairs with him. We went into the kitchen and Evans touched his wife's hand and then picked her up and carried her into the bedroom and put her on the bed. It was dark and there was no light on in the kitchen or the bedroom. I feel it certainly was a stocking I strangled her with. I didn't tie it round her neck, just wound it around her neck. Before I went downstairs I think I took the stocking off and threw it in the fireplace. I think there was a fire in the grate. I did not feel any effects of the gas." After Evans lay his wife on the bed, he fetched the quilt from the kitchen and put it over her. I told Evans that no doubt he would be suspect of having done it, because of the rows and fights he had had with his wife. He seemed to think the same. He said he would bring the van down that he was driving and take her away and leave her somewhere. I left him and went downstairs. I can't recollect seeing the baby there. I think Evans told me the next day that he had fed the baby. With regard to the infant, Geraldine, Timothy Evans had claimed in his confession that he had fed the child, while Christie had made attempts to move Beryl's body downstairs. But the older man had struggled with the task, and Evans went to assist him in moving the body to the kitchen on the middle floor. Evans claimed he did not know what happened to his wife's remains after that, believing that Christie had placed them in a drain, while he would go on to claim that Christie arranged for Geraldine to go and live with a childless couple in another part of London. Shortly after this, Timothy would head to Wales to reside with his aunt and uncle. Yet a month later he would present himself at the police station, admitting to the murder of his wife. Having told the Welsh police that the body was concealed in a drain outside Rillington Place, London officers quickly arrived at the property. A moment Christie recalled in his statement, quote, "Early in December, police called at the house and said they were making inquiries about Mrs. Evans. They told me they had got Evans in Wales and that he had made a statement that his wife had been put down a drain." One detail perturbed Christie when he learned of Timothy's confession. He questioned how Evans had known that Beryl had been strangled. After all, Christie had removed the ligature prior to the husband returning home. He voiced his confusion in his statement, quote, "When I left Evans in the bedroom on that Tuesday evening, he did not know that his wife had been strangled. He thought she had gassed herself. I don't know where he first found out that his wife had been strangled. I never mentioned it to him." In saying this, Christie may have been insinuating that Evans had been fed information regarding the details of the case in order to get his confession to match with the evidence, alluding to the fact that as the actual murderer, Christie should have been the only one to know this detail. However, even Christie's confession failed to match the evidence. He claimed that he had strangled Beryl with a stocking. Dr. Tier, who performed the post-mortem 3 years earlier, surmised that the marks were more consistent with a rope. His statement also failed to take into account the bruising on Beryl's cheeks, which suggests she had been physically attacked shortly before her death. It also contradicted his initial alibi, in which he claimed he had been out of the house when the crime was believed to have occurred, and he was not home when Timothy Evans returned at 6 o'clock. Christie's whereabouts were confirmed. He had attended a doctor's appointment around the relevant time. To corroborate Christie's statement, the exhumation of Beryl and Geraldine Evans was arranged, with the autopsy being overseen by the original pathologist, Dr. Tier, as well as Dr. Camp and the eminent pathologist, Keith Simpson. The latter concluded Beryl had been strangled, not gassed. There was nothing in Tier's original autopsy that appeared to have been overlooked, and no one could reasonably suggest that a pathologist of Dr. Tier's ability and experience could possibly have overlooked coal gas poisoning in a case of such a nature. I am obliged to say that exhumation proved unrewarding. The finding that there was no trace that Beryl had been poisoned by gas is the most crucial discrepancy between the evidence and Christie's confession, all adding to the continued debate regarding whom the real killer was. However, this confession was enough for Beryl to be added to the list of Christie's victims. As he drew to the end of his statement, he retained his usual manner of being uncertain about the details, a habit that would be commented on later in court. With him seeming to second-guess himself, he continued by stating, "I feel certain I strangled Mrs. Evans, and I think it was with a stocking. I did it because she appealed to me to help her commit suicide. I have got it in the back of my mind there was some other motive, but I am not clear about it. I don't know anything about what happened to the Evans' baby. I don't recollect seeing the baby on the Tuesday or any time after that." Unfortunately, no one else can confirm what happened to 13-month-old Geraldine. Her father was convicted and hanged for her murder, yet the manner of death, being strangulation, and the fact her body had been concealed in the wash-house, close to her mother's remains, calls into question whether Christie knew more than he was prepared to admit. In the final part of his statement, Christie would add some of the missing pieces regarding the deaths of Rita Nelson, Kathleen Maloney, and Hectorina McLennan. Bringing his testimony in line with the evidence he had been presented with, he reported, quote, "I gassed the 3 women whose bodies were found in the alcove by getting them to sit in the deck chair in the kitchen between the table and the door. There is a gas pipe on the wall next to the window. The pipe had been plugged. I took the plug out and pushed a piece of rubber tubing over the pipe and let it hang down nearly to the floor. There was no tap on it, so I put a kink in the tube with a bulldog clip to stop the gas escaping. When they sat in the deck chair with the tube behind them, I just took the clip off and let the fumes rise from the back of the deck chair. When they started getting overcome, that's when I must have strangled them." As the trial approached, Christie was remanded in Brixton Prison, where he socialised with other inmates, with whom he would play chess and openly speak of his temperament, describing himself as a gentleman, and it was that quality which had made him a ladies' man, with him claiming, quote, "Girls were attracted to me." It was alleged by one inmate, Daniel Heaney, that while in a state of undress, Christie had pointed at his appendage and boasted that it was the reason he had so many visitors at Rillington Place. This same inmate would also recall Christie claiming, quote, "I have just drunk my urine and enjoyed it." Regarding the murders, Christie tried to paint them as being kind deaths, with him referring to the public outcry, quote, "I gave them a merciful end. The mob should remember that." Yet in another statement he showed his more callous side, when he stated, "You can't help feeling that women who give you the come-on wouldn't be so smug if helpless or dead. Cats should be cuddled, not throttled. Animals and birds are my friend. Women, well, that's different." One has to question whether this behaviour was a front to make himself appear more impressive to his fellow inmates. Or was he trying to play the role of someone who was mentally disturbed? The question of whether Christie was mentally fit to stand trial would be answered after he was assessed by multiple psychiatrists during his internment at Brixton Prison. Criminal psychologist Stephen Coates produced a report on Christie, in which he wrote, "Mr. Christie is not insane. He suffers from acute anxiety hysteria, the anxiety being mostly centred on sex fears. He would probably be unable to approach normal sexual intercourse at all, and if at all, then only with considerable fear. He would appear to have a dread of women. A sad, unhappy, rather inadequate anxiety-ridden man, with a considerable amount of repression, especially of aggression. There is little to explain Mr. Christie's criminal acts, except for the suggestion that they were committed to ward off acute feelings of fear produced in him by women." While another expert, Dr. Matheson, would draw similar conclusions, stating, "Christie had a very weak sex instinct, and to complete the sexual act he needs considerable stimulation by adopting perverse practices. He has, I think, to render the woman with whom he was going to have intercourse unconscious before he began, lest he prove impotent and again subject to jeers and have it revealed once more that sexually he was not a normal man. Having done it once, and not being found out, it tempted him to repeat the act." Dr. Curran, who would visit Christie on the 20th and the 25th of May, would present his report. Quote, Christie was alert and attentive, obsequiously polite and quick in grasp, except occasionally when asked an awkward question. He was apt to be circumstantial, often adding irrelevant details, this apparently being motivated by a desire to show himself in as good a light as possible, or to play for time when uncertain what lie to tell. He prided himself on his abstemious habits, and I could find no reason to associate his crimes with alcoholic intoxication. Physical examinations and investigations have been negative, and he is not epileptic. When speaking about Ethel's death, the doctor noted that Christie would become emotional, and at one point cried, but he recalled that overall the accused was, quote, happy rather than depressed, his usual attitude being one of would-be cooperative interest in an intriguing problem. When discussing neutral topics, his emotional responses seems quite normal. Turning to Christie's cognitive function, Dr. Curran reported that, quote, his memory is good on general and neutral topics. As regards to the crisis, however, he explained apologetically that his memory was apt to come and go, and his stories varied from 1 minute to the next in response to suggestions made. I could find no evidence of delusions, hallucinations, or misinterpretations. Continuing to address the issues with Christie's memory, Curran wrote, personally, I do not believe Christie's alleged loss of memory is genuine. It is in my opinion too inconsistent, variable, patchy, and selective to be genuine. It is striking how Christie remembers what he regards as being in his own favour, and forgets, or can only remember transiently, what is not. His lies seem to me to be purposive, if not convincing. Christie has, however, like many other criminals and murderers, a remarkable capacity for dismissing the unpleasant from his mind. This capacity helps to explain that common finding in murderers, as in the case of Christie, namely, lack of remorse. How can one regret what one cannot recall? Christie is well aware of and interested in his lack of remorse. As he put it to me, it must have been planned on each occasion, but if I did plan it, I never gave it another thought. I must have remembered putting the bodies in the alcove, but I do not remember doing so, and I never thought about them. Curran commented on this last claim, stating, this amounts to saying out of sight, out of mind. But be it noted, not out of mind all the time, for Christie used disinfectant to reduce the unpleasant smells. As Christie would be standing trial for the murder of Ethel, it was important to establish the accused's state of mind at the time of his wife's death, to which Dr. Curran concluded that, quote, I could find no evidence that Christie at the time of the murder of his wife was suffering from any defect of reason due to disease of the mind, nor that he is suffering now. His behaviour both before and after the murder of his wife and of 3 prostitutes forms a sequence that seems to me to show that he knew what he was doing and knew it was wrong. I do not think Christie is medically insane, and he is certainly not mentally defective. On the contrary, he is above average intelligence. I regard Christie as being the possessor of a highly abnormal character rather than the victim of a mental illness or disease. Christie is, in my opinion, fit to plead and to stand his trial. End quote. With Dr. Curran and the other psychiatrists concluding that Christie was competent to stand trial, the proceedings began on the 22nd of June 1953 at the Old Bailey in London, where we would stand in the same dock that Timothy Evans had stood 3 years earlier. Although he had been charged with multiple murders, he would only face trial for the death of his wife Ethel. However, in an unusual and some would consider risky move, the defence attorney Derek Curtis Bennett opted to allow for the details of the other murders to be disclosed to the court, as he believed that it would help to prove that Christie was insane when he committed these crimes, with the defendant entering a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. During the proceedings, which lasted for 4 days, the jury would not only be presented with the graphic details of each murder, but they heard the arguments between the defence and prosecution relating to Christie's mental state at the time of each murder, with the defence expert Dr. Jack Hobson stating that Christie suffered from severe hysteria and that during the commission of the crimes the defendant did not completely see the wrongful nature of his actions. The prosecution would refute these claims, arguing that the degree of premeditation combined with his efforts to conceal the crimes are not the actions of an insane person. By the end of the 4 days, the jury took almost an hour and a half to reach the conclusion that Christie was guilty of the murder of his wife Ethel. Returning back to the courtroom, the judge, Justice Finneman, had the black silk cap placed upon his head, and he passed the sentence of death upon Christie. John Christie was taken to Pentonville prison following the verdict, where he was placed in the condemned cell to await execution. There he would stare at the same 4 walls, pace the same floor, and sleep in the same bed as Timothy Evans had done 3 years earlier. And soon his sentence would be carried out by the same man. In the 10 days between his sentencing and execution, there would be demands from members of Parliament to postpone the sentence while an inquiry into the Evans case was carried out. After all, Christie was a key witness in the case, and his confession had led to questions regarding Evans's guilt. A brief investigation was carried out by John Scott Henderson QC, who had less than a week to compile a report including interviewing Christie and reviewing all the evidence. But the amount of time allowed in comparison to the magnitude of the case led to later complaints that the inquiry was flawed, as it could not have taken into account all aspects of the crime before reaching the conclusion that Evans was guilty of murdering both Beryl and Geraldine. Calls for the suspension of the execution while a more thorough inquiry was conducted were rejected, with the Speaker of the House reminding the members that they cannot interfere in the case, and the burden fell upon the Home Secretary, with the Speaker reminding his fellow members that, quote, matters of the prerogative of mercy and the postponement of execution were within the responsibility of the Home Secretary, which was a very heavy one. He could be criticised afterwards for what he did, but until the sentence was exercised, the matter could not be raised either by question or debate. And so, on the 15th of July 1953, John Reginald Halliday Christie, the unassuming, softly-spoken Yorkshireman who had taken 8 lives, would go to the gallows, where his life was ended by fellow Yorkshireman Albert Pierrepoint. This was not the end of the story, as Christie's confession called into question whether an innocent man had been hanged, or was it possible that there had been 2 killers residing under one roof? Over the years, various people have advocated for both sides of the debate, with books and essays arguing the case for both possibilities. Amidst all this, the stories have been told and retold, with new details added, embellished, and like a game of Chinese whispers, details changed and inaccuracies crept in, with the Home Secretary Roy Jenkins stating in 1966, quote, it is now impossible to establish the truth beyond doubt. It would not be until the end of 1965 that Timothy Evans's conviction would be reviewed, during an inquiry led by High Court Judge Sir Daniel Braben, who ultimately concluded that, quote, it is more probable than not that Evans did not murder his baby daughter Geraldine, for which he was hanged, with the report surmising that John Christie was likely to be the one responsible, and that he was motivated to kill the child in order to prevent questions being asked as to why the infant was there but the mother was not. The report would also state, quote, it was more probable than not that Evans did murder his wife Beryl, for which he was never tried. Braben's inquiry also speculated that if Evans had faced a retrial, that another jury may have found him not guilty, as there was too much uncertainty regarding some of the details, meaning he could not be found guilty beyond reasonable doubt. In conclusion, Sir Braben recommended that the Home Secretary Roy Jenkins grant Evans a posthumous pardon, a recommendation which would be acted upon on the 18th of October 1966, when Timothy Evans was granted a free pardon by the Queen, 16 years after he had been executed for the murder of his daughter. But the question still remains, was Christie's confession that he killed Beryl truthful? And had he used Timothy, a simple-minded man with a history of spousal abuse, as a scapegoat? Or had he helped Timothy cover up the murder and offered to help him find a home for Geraldine, only to kill the 13-month-old? Or did Timothy claim the lives of both his wife and daughter? Braben report says that he probably didn't, but the use of the word probably does not dispel the uncertainty. This would only be added to by a further report in 2003, in which Lord Brennan QC, acting as an independent assessor, awarded Evans's half-sister Mary and sister Eileen compensation relating to the miscarriage of justice that occurred through Evans's trial and sentencing, with Lord Brennan acknowledging, quote, "The conviction and execution of Timothy Evans for the murder of his child was wrongful and a miscarriage of justice, and that there is no evidence to implicate Timothy Evans in the murder of his wife. She was probably murdered by Christie." Yet despite this finding, there will always be uncertainty, for 2 killers have resided in Rillington Place, a home long since demolished, but its legacy still haunts those who are caught in the debate between innocence and guilt. I would love to hear your thoughts on this case, one that took me down the rabbit hole and led me to dead ends and contradictions. Normally I don't insert my own opinions, but I do believe that when it comes to the deaths of Geraldine and Beryl, both men knew more than they were prepared to admit. In the next episode, I will continue the Albert Pierrepoint series, focusing on the cases of the women whose death sentences he would carry out, amidst the continued debates regarding the viability and morality of the death penalty. So in the meantime, keep an eye on those shadows.